Okay, so as always, first of all, I want to thank all the women who came in to do Tikkun HaKlali today. We said a tremendous amount of books. It should be a schus for all of Am Yisrael, and it should be a schus for everybody who came to daven in here today. I feel extremely privileged as always, and I feel especially privileged today with Rabbi Ken Spiro. So Rabbi Ken Spiro's quick-paced, humorous style catches and keeps an audience interest. His ability to explain deep concepts clearly makes an impact that lasts long after the presentation. Rabbi Spiro is a senior lecturer and researcher for Aish Torah, Jerusalem. In addition, he is a licensed tour guide from the Israel Ministry of Tourism. He graduated from Vassar College with a BA in Russian language and literature and did graduate studies at the Pushkin Institute in Moscow. He has an MA in history from the Vermont College of Norwich University and rabbinic ordination from Yeshiva Aish Torah in Jerusalem. He has appeared on numerous radio and television programs, such as the BBC, radio and TV, the National Geographic Channel, the Discovery Channel, the History Channel, Channel 4 England, and Arat Sheva, Israel National Radio. He is the author of World Perfect, The Jewish Impact on Civilization, published by HCL Books, Crash Course in Jewish History, published by Targum Press and Destiny, Why a Tiny Nation Plays Such a Huge Role in History, published by Geffen Publishing House. His writings and seminars can be accessed on www.kenspiro.com and www.aish.com. I actually put everything on the WhatsApp group, and once I publish the recording, I will put everything on there. He was raised in the US. He has lived in Israel since 1982. He served in a combat infantry unit in the IDF. He is a father of 5 children, currently lives in Jerusalem. And I actually first met him many, many years ago. He did something at Aish Torah in Thornhill. And I remember I was so mesmerized after hearing Rabbi Spiro. It was like something very, very special. So with that, he's also on YouTube, but that I will post. With that, I feel so privileged. Thank you so much, Rabbi Spiro, and it's yours. I'm going off. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you, Naomi. Very nice to be with you, everyone, today. I see a lot of ladies on here. That's fantastic. Big audience. Just a shame I can't see everyone's faces. Ever since COVID came along, it's been difficult to like. Oh, there now I see people's faces. Okay. Well, in a minute, I'm going to share a PowerPoint with you all. So you're not going to see any video. I'll be on the side. But I decided to do a presentation today. It's going to take a little longer than a half hour. I'm not sure how much I can squeeze in, but I think it's well worth it. So I hope no one's in a big rush. But if you have to leave in the middle, I understand. I wear basically the 2 hats. I wear the rabbi hat and I wear the historian hat. And history is one of the big black holes of, unfortunately, most Jews' education. I've been doing a little survey over the years asking yeshiva guys who has read all of Tanakh, 24 books of the Hebrew Bible. It is shocking how few. I think I'm at like 5 or 6 guys out of, I estimate, 4 or 5,000 people I've asked. So history is such a fantastic way. It's not an accident that's called his story. One of the best ways to really understand how God runs the world is to look at, what's happened to us in the past. And that's what I like to focus on and combine our past with an understanding that there's the big guy upstairs, so to speak, who's running the show. So the presentation I want to do today, since we're on a fast day, beginning a 3-week period of working up to the 9th of Av, and hopefully by then we'll have the Beit HaMikdash back, so we won't have to be fasting. You guys can all fly into Israel, and we'll have one big party in Jerusalem, God willing. But in expectation of maybe pushing that process forward, I wanted to focus on a topic which I think is so important and so overlooked and very critical to our understanding of who we are and what our mission is in the world. So I'm going to first try and share my screen over here. Let me see what we can do. There it is. And I share. Let's go. Let's see if that works. And let me now do it as here we go. I want to go the other way. 1 second. Let me get to this is why God created teenagers to take care of our technology. Okay, I hope everyone can see that. Yes, it's good. Naomi, we can all see that. We see the screen. And just
Perfect.
Okay, great. Okay, so we're gonna go through a little PowerPoint called Universalism and Particularism. So everyone should just hold on tight because we're going to move fast, but I think you'll find this extremely interesting and I think a really important point to focus on, especially on a fast day and during the weeks that follow in terms of us getting focused on what we need to do in this world to come to the end of the story as quickly and as painlessly as possible. So the topic is interesting. And to begin with, my Rosh Hashiva, Rav Noach Weinberg Zatzal, always taught me you never use a term unless you could define it. Let's define some terms here. Universalism versus particularism. So what's universalism? It's loyalty to and concern for others without regard to national or other allegiances. It's thinking about the whole world together as one giant, we are the world kind of worldview, versus particularism, which is exclusive attachment to one's own group, party, or nation. So these are two different ways of looking at ourselves and the world around us. And we should appreciate that this sort of dichotomy has been following us throughout all of human history. Like a little black guy at the bottom is the particularist guy, thinking about it, where the earth at the top is the universal. The world has been going back and forth like a pendulum swinging literally for thousands of years through these worldviews. Just to do a quick review of a little bit of past history, if we go back to the medieval period, and this is general history, we'll get to the Jewish stuff in a little bit. But if you go to the medieval period, if you can look at Europe, for those of you maybe learned some history, medieval Europe was very particularistic, meaning thinking about just who we are, our group, sort of against the rest of the world. In the case of Europe, it was they viewed themselves as Christians. Christendom, as it was called, was a very particularistic worldview. But when we get out of the medieval period, which is the mid 14th century, we enter the Renaissance. And the Renaissance was all about rediscovering the classical humanistic worldview of the Greeks and the Romans, which was more of a universalistic way of looking at the world, which sort of led humanity in the Western world into what we call the Age of Enlightenment. And the Age of Enlightenment was a very universalistic way of looking at the world. The idea that it's not so much about my tribe, my family, my country, but now it's about principles, rules, laws, whether they're in science or morality or government, that can govern all of humanity. That's the real universalistic way of looking at the world. And I would say the greatest hit song of that period of time, not that they had a playlist back then, but that would be Beethoven's Ninth Symphony, which I'm sure most of you know the actual melody, da 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 da. So the German poet Friedrich Schiller, you can see him on the right, he put that to words, and it's originally in German. But if you look at what I highlighted in red, there is the real universalistic line. Alle Menschen würde Bruder. All men are brothers. Like the French Revolution, liberty, equality, fraternity, the brotherhood. They weren't into, they weren't so politically correct back then, so they kept using everything in the male terminology. All men are created equal, or men are brothers. But it's the idea of a universalistic view that is not connected to one faith, one piece of real estate, or one country. The problem is that it's human nature that we all need to feel part of something, not just part of the world as a whole. And people will naturally gravitate towards connecting to a group, be that a tribe, a clan, or a country. So as the world progresses through this period of time in history, we get to what is post-Enlightenment, and we get to the early 20th century in World War I. And World War I is a very particularist conflict, where if you look at the images here, the recruitment posters, they're very particularist in that it's focusing on identification with a country, patriotism. And World War I is a very destructive conflict, but countries are literally drawn into a massive conflict over loyalty to their nations. And we know 10 million people die in that conflict. And if World War I didn't happen, well, we know it wouldn't have happened after, which would have been World War II. And World War II is much more destructive war. It's 5 times as many people killed, 50 million people killed. It's interesting that World War II kind of pits some very particularistic worldviews, which is Nazi Germany, which is Nazism, even though it's socialism, it's national socialism, and Imperial Japan, which is emperor worship, and the Japanese are obsessive with their preserving their cultural identity. Until today, by the way, Japan is one of the most ethnically pure places in the world. It's 98% racially pure Japanese. So those against the liberal democratic countries of Europe, and that of course leads, unfortunately, to not only the death of 50 million people at large, but 12 million people murdered by Adolf Hitler, 6 million of whom are us, the Jewish people. But also what emerges at this period of time is another interesting kind of political universalistic worldview, which is progressive left-wing politics that is epitomized by what we call communism. And communism is all about a global ideology. Remember Marx, workers of the world unite. It's not about workers of this country unite or that country. It's about identifying as part of the working class that transcends national borders. And communism, of course, put the party ideology above the individual completely. And we think of Hitler as being one of the biggest mass murderers of all time. If you actually look at the 20th century, he's only number 3. The guy who has number 1 position as mass murder is Mao Zedong, who in the Cultural Revolution may have led to the death of 60 million Chinese. Joseph Stalin on the left, the communist leader of Russia during World War II. He's credited with 25 million people. That's Pol Pot on the right of Cambodia. He gets a mere million. But that ideology, which completely obliterated any particularist individualism and hyper-focused on this universalistic, you're a member of it's just one giant group identity, proved to be incredibly destructive, but is not a chidush. It's not a new idea in human history. You have to ask, where is the first, I like doing the class live so people can respond, but where is the first universalistic, particularist political movement or story in human history? It goes back to Migdal Bavel. And Migdal Bavel was all about that. The world unites. I always say Migdal Bavel, the plot is humanity unites, but for all the wrong reasons. What do we call that today? The United Nations. But the United Nations of 3,000, of going back more than 4,000 years ago was everyone on earth had the same language and the same words. That's as universalistic as you can get. But look at what happened as a consequence of that story. It says, Rabbi Ken said there were no stones that there were, weird English, with to build the city and the tower. They didn't have any natural rock. What did they do? They baked bricks and burnt them into like a builder, mud bricks, until they built a 7 mil high, a tower 7 mil high, and it had ascents on the east and the west. The laborers who took up the bricks went up on the eastern side, and those who descended went down on the western side. If a man fell and died, they paid no heed to him. But if a brick fell, they sat down and wept and said, "Woe is us! When will another one come in its stead?" So at Pirkei de Rabbi Eliezer, the Midrash is telling us here is exactly the idea. The individual, the particular identity of individuals, completely negated for the sake of the cause and the party. And there you have what will fast forward literally 4,000 plus years later, and you get exactly the same thing happening with hyper-universalism in the world. But if we keep going in our story of what happens in history, we know that once we get past World War II and how destructive it was, ironically, they called World War I the war to end all wars, hardly accomplished that one. But the Western liberal democratic world moves into a very universalistic kind of worldview, focusing on, free love and equality for all, and all these ideas that you could see as Martin Luther King in there, John F. Kennedy, whatever. And the greatest hit song of that period of time is certainly, I always call it my best worst song. I'm by the way, a little background to me that wasn't mentioned in my bio, that by the way my mother wrote all of that, so you got to take it with a grain of salt. But I'm not born religious. I'm FFA. There's FFB. There's from birth. There's BT Balchuva. I'm from Aish. So I came from a very secular background, and so I experienced. I was a DJ actually when I was in college. And I always said my favorite, back then I liked the song more than since I've done Tshuva. I'm less into the lyrics, to say the least. But John Lennon's song Imagine is the greatest hit song, whereas Beethoven's Ode to Joy and the words by Schiller going back to the 18th century may have been the biggest hit back then. The song that epitomizes to the max what the universalistic sort of left-wing progressive political worldview has come into is John Lennon's song Imagine. And look at the words there. Imagine there's no heaven. It's easy if you try. No hell below us. Above us, only sky. Imagine all the people living for today. Imagine there's no countries. It's not hard to do. Nothing to kill or die for, and no religion, too. Imagine all the people living life in peace. It sounds very nice, but it is absolutely a completely impossible reality to live with. And by the way, such a worldview of nothing to live or die for and no God above would be the end of humanity as we know it. But we're not going to go into analyzing There is a good book about it, John Lennon and the Jews. You can see down below, where Zev Magen, a very left-wing Israeli journalist, rips the song to pieces for how destructive it is. But it sounds nice in theory. Everyone just get along and love each other. But if we look where we are today in the world, and I say us, we're not talking about us as observant Jews. I'm talking about the world in the West today, America specifically, but also Europe. You have the left. It's all about, it's interesting because there is a sort of particularist twinge to it because it's no longer about countries and borders. It's all about gender, ethnicity, sexual orientation. But look, it says build bridges, not walls, and Black Lives Matter. It's all about including everyone in the big picture. This is not just in the United States. This is what you see in the European left of today, a very universalistic worldview. This is not an American thing. Look at the images here. Black Lives Matter everywhere. No human is illegal. Like we don't have any borders. Just open up there. Be open to everything and anything, and everything else is just setting up barriers between us and has to be eliminated. On the other side, you have the more conservative, particularist right in America. Look at the signs there: protect our police and our borders, secure our borders, make America first. It's all about my identity as part of a specific country and preserving that. You get that in Europe. That's what the right is about, of keeping the refugees out, of having dividing lines between in sexuality and things like that. Everything has to be blurred on one side and everything has to be very much defined on the other. So this is where the world has actually gotten to today. And here we go. And I want to just focus in on how this manifests itself kind of as political entities and political parties and governmental systems. Here you have on the left the Universalists. Here you have on the right the Particularists. One of these is top down and one of these is bottom up. And when I say top down and bottom up, let me explain myself. If you go to the political left, they're the top down people. When I say top down, they look at government as taking care of everything. So these guys want big government, a lot of taxes, and tons of legislation because government will take care of you cradle to grave. It's even if it means abrogating our responsibility and our freedom, let government take over. Whereas the bottom up people are the political right. If you take the Tea Party in America, for instance, what do they want? Big or small government? Obviously, small government. And therefore, little taxes because it's a small government, doesn't cost a lot of money, and minimum amount of legislation and governmental interference in my life because I want maximum amount of. My computer just started talking to me. Okay. Hold on 1 second. Oh that is weird. Now we know we're being listened to by everything on our computers. That was strange. Okay, so the Tea Party guys, they want maximum autonomy, maximum freedom. Don't tell me what to do. Now you see how it actually, the worldview is impacted. This is why the universalistic people tend to veer towards the left in politics. In the case of America, that's the Democratic Party, while the particulars people tend to veer towards the conservative side, the right, which would be the Republican Party. Let's pause for a second and let's focus on like how did this impact us? Backing up quickly to the Age of Enlightenment. When we lived in Europe before the Age of Enlightenment, when it was Christendom, this was not a good situation for us. We were the only other in a world that identified very particularistically as a different faith. And we suffered very intensely because of that, because we were the Jew amongst the Gentiles who were all kind of homogeneously one group of people. But the Enlightenment, which is talking about the brotherhood of humanity and all that great stuff, seemingly was fantastic for us, the Jewish people, because it's no longer about my specific religious identity. We're all human beings. We all have rights. We all have the same responsibilities. By the way, the great purveyor or the great, I should ask, shame you can't answer live, but who is the political leader in Europe in the early 19th century who pushed emancipation of Jews and including them in the big tent of the Enlightenment of Europe? Like, let's give them rights. Let's take them out of the ghettos. Who is it? Anyone know? You can't answer, unfortunately. It was a Corsican artillery officer who was very famous for always having his hand in his jacket when he's getting painted, Napoleon Bonaparte. Napoleon was obsessed with emancipation. He writes, I will never accept any proposal that will obligate the Jewish people to leave France, because for me, the Jews are the same as any other citizens in our country. That's really beautiful sounding, right? Let's be fair to them, treat them equally. It takes weakness to chase them out of the country, but it takes strength to assimilate them. That's the scary part. Because when Napoleon opens up, because he's not the person who grants Jews rights. He reconfirms the rights granted by Jews in the French Revolution in 1791. But his conquest of Europe lets the genie out of the bottle, so to speak. And by the end of the 19th century in Western Europe, all Jews finally achieve, in theory, not necessarily in practice, equal rights as citizens of the countries in which they live. And what did they do? They run to take advantage of everything they couldn't do literally for 1,000 years, to be doctors, to lawyers, to go to university, to go to the army, to hold political office. But that often comes at the expense of what? Obviously, their Jewish identity. It's a topic I speak on a lot, but I always say if the anti-Semites really wanted to get rid of us, chas v'chalila, they would leave us alone and let us just do all the fun stuff we can and intermingle with them. And we would basically commit suicide, not literally, but through assimilation. We're much better at killing ourselves off by losing our identity in our desperation to embrace the wider welcoming cultures of the world when we're just left to our own. And what happens, and this has proven to be the greatest challenge for the Jewish people, by the way, not to get into this topic now, but far more Jews have died, not being murdered, since the Holocaust than Hitler, Yamach Shemo, killed in the Holocaust by being loved to death by the non-Jewish world. It's proved to be a big challenge, which really brings us to the heart of the whole matter. And the reaction to that open door policy of the Gentiles is quite interesting. And I made a little like chart here to show you what happened. In the middle is TO. TO is Torah observant Jews. When the gates of Western Europe open up, this is not Eastern Europe, where probably most of you are from or ancestors are from, but when England, France, Germany, those places, when they open up their doors to the Jews, so some Jews stay religious, TO, Torah observant, but some move to the left, to the Reform movement, which we'll talk about in a minute, which is a movement trying to create a version of Judaism which allows Jews to minimize their Jewish identity and engage with Western culture. Some Jews just drop their Judaism, become Jews culturally, in name alone, but not in any way in terms of observance. And some Jews go so far as to convert, not out of a love of Christianity, but more out of a desire to get around a lot of the impediments and restrictions that Jews still faced, even though technically they were equal citizens. But just to look at this for a minute, this is the Reform movement. Which started in Hamburg, Germany in 1811. This is Naftali Frankfurter. And he writes, for Judaism, the principle of human dignity is cosmopolitan. There's the universal worldview he's talking about. But I would like to put a proper emphasis on the love of particular people amongst whom we live and its individual members. As men, we love all mankind. There it is, that beautiful kind of Schiller-like statement, all Menschen würde Bruder, all men are brothers. But as Germans, we love the Germans as the children of the fatherland. We are and ought to be patriots, not merely cosmopolitan. So here is interesting. They're trying to balance that kind of universalistic, enlightened European worldview with a specific love and loyalty towards what was the highest culture of Europe at the time, which was Germany. This is Samuel Holtheim, the most impactful, along with Abraham Geiger, the most impactful person in the Reform movement in the 19th century. He writes, the hope for national restoration, which this is pre-Zionism, meaning going back to Israel, contradicts our feelings for the fatherland. The wish to return to Palestine in order to create their political empire is superfluous. But messianic hope, truly understood, is religious. This latter religious hope can be renounced only by those who have a more sublime conception of Judaism and who believe that the fulfillment of Judaism's mission is not dependent on the establishment of a Jewish state, but rather by the merging of Jewry into the political constellation of the fatherland, which is a fancy way of saying assimilating into Germany. Only an enlightened conception of religion can replace a dull one. This is the difference between strict orthodoxy, which is a term that was invented by the Reform movement, by the way, to make religious Jews look bad and look ossified and inflexible, and the Reform. Both approach Judaism from a religious standpoint, but while the former, meaning those orthodox dinosaurs, aim at the restoration of the old political order, the latter, meaning us modern progressive Reform, aim at the closest possible union with the political and national union of our times. So they not only rejected, by the way, traditional Jewish observance, which is very particularistic, But they also rejected any notion of Jewish nationalism. When Zionism is finally born 40 years later, they will be hardcore anti that. Very interesting. And here, by the way, is the other example. The most extreme reaction taken is someone like Chaim Chaim, who converts to Christianity not because he believes in Jesus, but because there are a lot of restrictions to him furthering his career to become the greatest, most impactful literary figure in early 19th century German writing. He says, from the nature of my thinking, you can deduce that the baptism is a matter of indifference to me, that I do not regard as important, even symbolically. The baptism certificate is a ticket of admission to European culture. So we see how destructive this open door universalistic idea was to Jewish identity, especially in Western Europe, where people run out of the ghetto to embrace Western civilization, often at the expense of their Jewish identity. And in the case of America, in Eastern Europe, where you don't have this enlightened open door policy, not just for Jews, but for everyone, the serfs in Russia were treated like garbage all the way through the mid 19th century. But with the massive explosion of anti-Semitism that follows the assassination of Tsar Alexander II in 1881, and this is the story of many of you who are listening, your ancestors, your grandparents, your great-grandparents, or great-great-grandparents, 2.5 million Jews between 1882 and 1920 will flee, and most of them will go to America, where they will come into contact with about 280,000 assimilated German Jews who had got there like 50 years earlier, and it's massively destructive to that Jewish population, which leads to a huge, and America is literally the melting pot, where it leads to a massive amount of assimilation, intermarriage. Look at this picture on the right here; it's unbelievable. This is like a wedding done with a chuppah, with a cross in the back, and a rabbi, and a priest officiating. Oh my God. But that leads to the destruction of an intermarriage rate of 70% to the United States. So what the late, great Jonathan Sachs, who I believe is one of the greatest Jewish thinkers of modern Jewish history, in my opinion, he summed it up beautifully, how this impacted us. I believe that at a certain point in history, Jews lost their faith in God and placed their trust in man. That's there it is. Beautifully said. That has been the story of Western civilization as a whole, but it happened to Jews more suddenly and poignantly than to anyone else. Beginning with the French Revolution, a new secular dispensation seemed to answer their prayers, and they invested it with all the hopes of a profoundly religious people. We Jews never do anything like halfway. We're always very intense about it. And we can see that Jews will go crazy over progressive political ideologies, believing that their inclusive nature, their non-particularist worldview, will be welcoming them in as citizens of the world and not looking at them as Jews in a Christian world or something like that, which is why, by the way, Jews are so hyper focused on progressive political ideologies. You know, it's in America, people think it's the 11th commandment, thou shalt vote Democrat, because it comes from a perception that this is the party that will look out for the underdogs. This is the party that will be the big tent that will include everyone. The right is particularist, and it's like racist and white. And okay, but this is not just America. The whole history of progressive left-wing political ideologies in the world is Jewish created and Jewish orchestrated, starting with Karl Marx, who was converted to Christianity but is 100% Jewish. Socialist leaders in Europe, Rosa Luxemburg or Leon Blum, twice socialist prime minister of France. If you look at the bottom here, you have the Russian Revolution of 1917. Okay, Lenin takes power, but everyone else in the revolution is a Jew. Leon Trotsky, Grigory Zinoviev, Lev Kamenev, all of them were killed by Stalin, by the way. These people were Moser Nefesh, as we say, for the cause of communism in the world. But why? Why are Jews so much like this? So the great literary critic, Edmund Wilson, he summed it up beautifully. He said the Jew lends himself easily to communism, and he's naturally inclined towards left-wing political ideology because it enables him to devote himself to a high cause involving all of humanity, characteristics which are natural to him as a Jew. Jews are naturally, spiritually hot-wired to be involved, to want to do this kind of stuff, a high cause. Top-down solutions. We Jews love it. By the way, if we rewind to Avram Avinu, what's the ultimate top-down solution in Judaism? God. And we are the people who brought that idea to the world. Ernst van den Haag wrote a book in 1969. This is when Jews were really mainstreaming into American society. He's a Dutch-American sociologist. The book is fascinating. It's called The Jewish Mystique. And look what he says about us. Because it's amazing when you quote things about Jews, always quote Gentiles talking about Jews. When Jews say things about Jews, no one believes it. But what does van den Hag say? It's a fantastic quote. The Jews have invented more ideas that have made the world more intelligible for a longer span and for more people than any other group. They have done this indirectly, always unintentionally, and certainly not in concert, but nevertheless comprehensively. Jews may call themselves humanists or atheists, socialists or communists. They may even dislike Jewishness and deny it in scientific terms. But rarely do they refuse to carry it. Unconscious or not, at least some part of every Jew does not want to give up his Jewishness. He says, even if Jews get into everything in the world, and every ism and every cause, and trying to transform the world, there's something baked into their Jewishness that makes it impossible for them to do it. And that's something I want to spend a couple of minutes on because it is so fascinating. And I want you all as a homework assignment to keep this running in the back of your brains as you deal with your friends and your family, your fellow Jews. It explains so much of who we are and what our greatest weaknesses are and our greatest strengths, of course, the Jewish personality. So this is, if you want to read more about this, go to the Ramchal, Rav Moshe Chaim Luzzatto, and Derech Hashem, and the Way of God. He talks about this, but it's not his original idea. We have an idea of, physical biology. You get, DNA from your parents, which is why kids look like the mommy or their daddy, or sometimes a mixture of both, or like neither. But Judaism has an idea of spiritual DNA, that all the original nations were large extended families that had genetic connections, but had personality traits that were actually baked into the personality and not learned from the outside. Now, these nations don't exist anymore today. We're one of the oldest surviving nations on the planet Earth. But thousands of years ago, you'd bump into someone on the street, not knowing where they were from. You'd talk to them for a few minutes and you go, oh my God, this guy's such a Midianite, or stop being such a Canaanite. Now, again, a lot of people have left the Jewish people and many people have joined, but the basic core of who we are goes back to Avram Avinu and Sarah Imenu. And if you study who they are, you understand who we are. We're all different like snowflakes, but who we are as the Jewish personality, it's so clear. God says, Avram Avinu in Breshis, he says, I have known him because he will command his children, his household after him, to keep God's ways, doing charity and justice. Avram has the right combination. And Sarah, to pass on the spiritual DNA to create the nation that will transform the world. And those three traits are radically transformative thinking. Non-Jews can be radical, but Jews are crazy radical. Incredible drive, because that's what it takes to push a radical idea into the world. You got to not care what anyone thinks, and caring. And you can see these traits that we Jews have. It's unbelievable. Van den Hag goes back in his book and talks about how radical Jews are. It's such an amazing quote. He says, utopian dreams, millennial prophecies, and messianic expectations are as much a part of the Jews' cultural heritage as their practical worldly attitude. With emancipation, Jews have tried to influence their actual environment in this world. But many have not given up their dreams. Many have become reformers. Many others have become radicals. Of all groups, Jews are most prone to expectation of radical change. Although very few Jews are radicals, very many radicals are Jews. Out of 100 Jews, 5 may be radicals, but out of 10 radicals, 5 are likely to be Jewish. What attracts them so disproportionately to radical causes? Jonathan Sachs even wrote a great book called Radical Then, Radical Now. What attracts them is the spiritual DNA of the Jewish people. And the last thing, and the next thing is the drive. Mark Twain, whose real name is Samuel Clemens, who also has 7 patents for suspenders, you should know. If that's ever on a game show and you get it right, I want 20%. Mark Twain says, if statistics are right, the Jews constitute but 1% of the human race. It suggests a nebulous dim puff of smoke lost in the blaze of the Milky Way. Properly, the Jew ought hardly to be heard of, but he is heard of, has always been heard of. He is as prominent on the planet as any other people, and his commercial importance is extravagantly out of proportion to the smallness of his bulk. His contributions to the world's list of great names in literature, science, art, music, finance, medicine, abstruse learning are also way out of proportion to the weakness of his numbers. He has made a marvelous fight in this world in all ages and has done it with his hands tied behind him. We are crazy, disproportionately overdriven, overaccomplished people. You look down below his picture, 0.2% of the world's population, but 22% of all the Nobel Prizes since 1901, which is 11,500% more than we should have. And that's just one little statistic. I could go on for 20 minutes showing Jewish overaccomplishment. And the last aspect of the spiritual DNA, which explains so much about us, is the caring. Remember, Avram was all about chesed, Avram and Sarah, being godlike, emulating the Almighty to bring people closer to him. Look what the late, great Paul Johnson, the historian, says about us. He says, Certainly, the world without the Jews would have been a radically different place. To them, meaning to us, we owe the idea of equality before the law, both divine and human, of the sanctity of life and the dignity of human person, of individual conscience and so personal redemption, of collective conscience and so social responsibility, of peace as an abstract ideal and love as the foundation of justice, and many other items which constitute the basic moral furniture of the human mind. Without the Jews, it might have been a much emptier place. It is almost beyond our capacity to imagine how the world would have fared if they had never emerged. Maybe we should read that in the UN. But there you see, that's a teeny version. I have a whole presentation on my website called Driven. You're welcome to go to my website and watch an hour-long presentation on the Jewish personality. It is a true eye-opener. But if we look at the Jewish personality, how it manifests itself today and Jewish identity today in America, in this, if you look at this article from 2012, it says, according to, this is a Pew Research study, according to the Public Research Institute survey on American Jewish values released this month, religious observance was a distant third in what Jews described as the most important quality of their Jewish identity. This is looking at the Jewish world as a whole, not the Orthodox Jewish world, obviously. When they said the word Jew to Jews, look what they say now. The most common answer at about 50% was commitment to social equality. That is the religion. That is what Judaism is to the majority of Jews in the United States. Religious observance, the closest quality to something like belief, was cited as the most important quality of Judaism only 17% of the time. Which means, think about this, my friends, when you take Jews out of Judaism, but they have that spiritual DNA, the radically transformative thinking, they care about the world and the drive, they are going to gravitate towards tikkun olam, as that is what Judaism is about. They're going to found every cause they could possibly think of. I'll just skip that graph. They're going to Jews for every ism but Judaism. You know, a third of students for justice in Palestine in American university campuses are Jewish. Driven, radical, transformative Jews who want to make the world a better place, who are actually siding with our enemies against the Jewish people and the Jewish state. Well-intended, but very misguided because they don't have that Torah software. This is Abraham Joshua Heschel, who normally you don't hear him quoted in the Orthodox world. He was actually involved in the conservative movement, but he's a really powerful, transformative thinking human being. He has a great line here. He said, the spirit of Judaism is not the spirit of conformity to American secular society, but above all, it is the spirit of protest against the confusion of the true God with many earthly false idols of this society, which changes in every generation, the Avodah Zorah. To be a Jew is to renounce allegiance to false gods, to remain free of infatuation with worldly triumphs, and never to succumb to splendor. To be totally into, I say, to be into truth and reality and emulating the Almighty. Now, to go back to this chart again, and here's where it gets interesting. We looked at the response going to the left of the open door policy of Europe and Jews losing their identity. But if you know the laws of physics, we know for every action, there's an equal and opposite reaction. And if you look on the right, it says UO. UO is ultra-Orthodoxy, the Haredi world, which is somewhat different in Israel than is in America, which is more the yeshiva world. I'm going to say something that's going to shock some people, but the ultra-Orthodox world of today is actually very new. I'm not talking about in kashrus and Shabbos observance. No, that goes back to Mount Sinai. But a massive community where everyone is conforming to a certain standard of dress, behavior, where everyone is learning in yeshiva. This is something we only see literally in the 20th century. Yeshiva learning, by the way, 100 years ago was 0.01% of Jews were doing it because everyone was trying to just survive. It just didn't exist on the level it does today. It's just a reality. But today we now have a world which looks like this, which we've never had in Jewish history before. And that world is a reaction to what happened, not as a physical threat, although physical trauma to the Jewish world. I believe the Ashkenazi Jewish world in particular is suffering from post-traumatic stress disorder on an epigenetic level. So bad has been the pounding of the Jewish world, first physically by the Gentiles, and then spiritually by all these movements that came into existence with the Enlightenment, secular Zionism, and the Reform movement, and the Maskilim, the enlightened thinkers. It literally became the spiritual threat now exceeds the physical threat, and that world literally closed in on itself, creating the most, whereas the left movement on that chart going back here is open door policy to everything at the expense of our Judaism. This world is closed door policy to everything to keep it out. And you see this in its most extreme form, of course, if you come to northern Jerusalem. I call it the Bible Belt, Mea Shearim, where you have signs warning people to stay out of our neighborhood if you're different because we don't want your foreign influence infecting us. But let's focus on, because I know we're going over time here, but I want to focus on like bringing it all together now and understanding what should we do with this. So is Judaism a universal or a particularist faith? That's the big question. So to understand that, well, let's look at the system of what Judaism is made up of. And I know this is telling you the obvious things that you're all well aware of because you're a well-educated audience, but we know the mitzvot are divided into two groups. We call them chukim and mishpatim, and people often say the chukim are the ones we don't understand so clearly, like kashrut and things like that, and the mishpatim are civil laws, which have to do running a just society, laws of property ownership and marriage and divorce and things like that. But also they can be divided into what we call ben adam lechavero and ben adam lemakom. So we know that ben adam, the makom mitzvot are between us and God, and that's where the hukim fall into. The impact of kashrut on our soul is definitely something that has to do with our relationship with God and maintaining a clear path to spirituality, whereas the mishpatim are the human being interrelationships for civil society. But you see that Judaism is made up of not only positive and negative commandments, but these two kinds of commandments. It's a perfect holistic system designed by the perfect being. But so what is Judaism then? Is it one or the other? So if you look in Shmot, right before we stand at Mount Sinai and God's about to give us the Torah, this is I think, one of the most important couple of sentences in the entire Chumash is what God says to us here. You have seen what I did to the Egyptians, how I bore you on eagle wings and brought you to me. Now then, if you obey me faithfully and keep my commandments, you shall be a treasured possession among all the peoples. Kili kol haaretz. The whole earth is mine, but you are b'ni b'chori Yisrael. You're my firstborn. But you shall be to me a kingdom of priests and a holy nation. That terminology is very interesting because you guys know that the Jewish people as a whole were one giant family with tribes, but we have Kohanim. And Kohanim are like the holy of the holies of the Jewish people. We know that they have special regulations of not coming in contact with dead bodies, of who they can marry. My friends, what God is telling us here is you Jewish people, you are the priests of humanity. You have a responsibility towards the world, but you have a system that's designed to keep you separate to a certain extent from humanity. So in going back to this question of what is Judaism, universal or particular faith, we are history's most universal particularists, and the system of Torah is designed exactly to do that because we know that the Chukim, besides doing all these amazing things in our relationship with the Borei Olam, the creator of the universe, also set up a certain barriers between our ability to totally integrate and interact with the non-Jewish world, keeping kosher and Shabbat. It sets us apart, which is what it's supposed to do. But we also have to keep in mind, as God tells us, we are the conduit between God and humanity. We are the God squad. We can never forget about our responsibility, obviously, to our fellow Jews who are lost souls, tinuk shenishba, like the kids raised by the non-Jews in the halachic term, but also to humanity as a whole. We are responsible for them. And the reality is, as much as the world is out of kilter and swinging back and forth, and it affects us, the reality is the reason why it's swinging back and forth so wildly is because we as Jews are not doing what we're supposed to be doing. Not the left and not the right, not the secular and not the religious, in that we are lacking. This is not a zero-sum game. It's not all of this or all of that. It's both of these together. We are lacking the balance. And when I'm speaking to you guys who are connected, and I think this audience is probably all Torah observant people, we have to recognize, and this is an honest appraisal, if you're looking at who we are and where we're holding today in the frum world, we see that almost all the chumras people take upon themselves today are almost all ben adam the makom. How kosher we can keep, what we won't eat, what we won't wear, what we won't read or watch, who we won't interact with. I just want to say two comments about that. This is a fast day, and we're supposed to hear this on a fast day. First of all, being only against things is not a good business strategy. If Coca-Cola's motto was doesn't taste as bad as Pepsi, they would not sell a lot of soft drinks. You have to be for something, and we have a very proactive, positive message. We also have to recognize that we want to take on and build our relationship with God by taking on stringencies in the Ben Adam, the Makom department. We have to balance them against how they will impact our fellow Jews and our fellow human beings. You have to be twice as careful what comes out of your mouth as what you put in your mouth. This is such a huge point. I believe this is a game changer for us as as mitzvah observant Jews to make a difference in the world and start switching out of the defense mode to the offense mode. It's a huge, huge, huge point. And this is the best way it's stated in the entire Torah, in my opinion. And this is said by Hillel. And they lived at the worst period of time in Jewish history in the ancient world, when we're occupied by the Romans and Jews, and we're being pulled into classical Greek-Roman civilization, and there was schism in the Jewish world that was unbelievable, that led to civil wars. Even during the Great Revolt, when we're fighting the Romans, we're killing each other off because we're focusing on our differences and forgetting about our responsibility to each other. And Hillel said it the best: if I am not for myself, who will be for me? That's particularism. The most particularist relationship we have is with ourselves. But if I'm only about me, my community, my family, everything else out, what am I? I'm forgetting it. We have to now wake up, be balanced Jews, and go on the offense. Not trying to convert, conquer, and boss people around, but living and acting in a way that's a Kiddush Hashem, that inspires people. This is absolutely critical. And the way I look at a Jewish star, I don't know if anyone else has ever done this, but this is my own little chop. We have that top-down relationship with God, and we have the bottom-up relationship. And we got to combine the two. That's what a Magen David is about. We meet in the middle. The Ben Adam L'Chavaro, the Ben Adam L'Makom, as a balanced relationship. It gives us that Magen David, and it makes us the kind of Jews that we need to be in the world. So to close with a little bit of food for thought, my friends, on this very important day of introspection that is leading us into an extremely difficult period of time in human history in our past, and a very, very, very difficult period of time that is approaching us today with all the challenges we face both in Israel and in the Jewish world at large. We have to wake up and say, we are a messenger that have forgotten the message. Now, this holds true not just, I'm sorry, for secular Jews, who are Jews for every ism but Judaism, often into causes that are antithetical to the Jewish worldview, but it also holds true for the frum world that is so connected to Torah and mitzvahs. We have to understand that Torah and mitzvot are not the ends, they're the means to the ends. There's no Jewish people without Torah and mitzvahs. It's the guidance system, the fuel, and the payload of Judaism. We don't accomplish our mission and survive without it, but our mission is to be that God squad. That system is designed to make us into people that are supposed to be the good role models for the world, and the world desperately needs role models. People have to look at us and say, look at those Jews. Look at what amazingly nice, mensch-like people they are. Look at their families. Look at their education system, their communities. Look at their businesses. Look at that country in the Middle East. What's their secret? You guys ever heard the famous quote, imitation is the highest form of flattery? That is the shortest class you ever got on liberal democracy and Christianity. If it wasn't for us, even sometimes in the worst situations of persecution and expulsion, living at a higher level than the rest of the world, we would not have been able to transform the world the way we did, even with our hands tied behind us, facing all that anti-Semitism. And God knows now more than ever before, my friends, we desperately need to be doing this now, because Jews for Judaism make amazing role models for humanity. And the role models the world is looking at are the worst role models for the world. Actors, actresses, movie stars, athletes. I'm sorry. Some of these people are nice, but we are the people who are supposed to be the light to nations. We have to get this in our brains today and start living with it seriously for the sake of our fellow Jews and for the world. I just want to close, I know I'm way over time, but with two more quotes because they're beautiful. One is Thomas Cahill in his book, The Gift of the Jews. He says, unbelievers might wish to stop for a moment and consider how completely God, this God of justice and compassion, undergirds all our values. And it is just possible that human effort without this God is doomed to certain failure, meaning there's no liberal democracy if you take God out of the picture. All those who share this outrageous dream of universal brotherhood, peace, and justice, who dream the dreams and see the visions of the great prophets, must bring themselves to contemplate the possibility that without God, there is no justice. Beautifully said. I just want to end with one more quote from the late, great Rabbi Lord Jonathan Sacks. This is the best. This is my whole presentation I just did in 2 paragraphs. Fantastic. Everyone should get this and put this on their fridge. Judaism was, and to this day remains, unique in its combination of universalism and particularism. We believe that God is the God of all humanity. He created all. He is accessible to all. He cares for all. Yet there is also a relationship with God that is unique to the Jewish people. we as Jews are or should be secure in our relationship with God, the God who has revealed himself in the intimacy of love, whose expression is Torah. The challenge of faith in its particularity and universality is therefore today what it was in the days of Abraham and Sarah, to be true to our particular heritage while being a blessing to others, whatever their heritage. That is a formula for peace and graciousness in an era badly in need of both. And I cannot imagine saying it better than he did. And let's just hope that we, as the people who are most responsible, because we have that Torah wisdom and we have the clarity that the rest of the world doesn't have, that we wake up and get this message in our brains and start really working on becoming, at this period of time during the 3 weeks, balanced Jews, proactive Jews who are constantly looking for ways to do little Kiddush Hashem. By all of us doing those little Kiddush Hashem and reaching out to our fellow Jews and the rest of humanity, will make a change in the world. And we'll get to the end of the story and bring Mashiach soon and in our days. And again, sorry for going so long. I thank you very much.
No, Rabbi, no, you could go as long as you want, Rabbi Spiro. I have just a few questions.
Sure.
And I'm sure there's a few people that have a few questions. I just want some clarity on a few things you said.
Sure, please.
So first of all, the question that I first want to ask, this was actually brilliant and genius, and you are brilliant and genius, and the way that you bring it over is just unbelievable. So two things you brought in. There's two things I want to ask you. One of the things that we as the Orthodox community in the world created almost this protective barrier, and I want to bring in a point and ask you if you agree with that premise that I'm going to bring in. But before that, you said something so interesting. You said if you go back, right, to the 1800s, et cetera, when you look, I don't remember who the first one that wrote the whole thing about Germany being the fatherland. That was in 18 something, way before Germany then completely betrayed the Jewish people and went and killed, 6 million plus of us, right? So the question that I need to ask you is, you said, Jews have always had this need to somehow, the countries that we live in, we've given up this sense of who we really are, and we almost want to integrate so much, and we then take upon the nations. So the question that I have to ask you is, when Jews today in Canada, United States, Europe, and are told to do this by the rabbis, that we pledge allegiance to the United States, we make sure that we stand up, even privately, even when there is not an audience of Gentiles or government officials, how we, I remember growing up in Canada, and we always said the Canadian national anthem. The same, you see that very, very much in United States. Thanksgiving, the whole idea of celebrating Thanksgiving. And you hear very, very much the idea of American Jews, even within the religious communities, very, very much talking about this allegiance that we are supposed to have. Is that the same mistake, Rabbi? Is that the same sort of error, or it's not?
No, not at all. The halacha is, dinei de malchusa kedina. When we live in a country where we're treated equally by the non-Jews, we should make sure, especially because we're often accused of dual loyalty, of making sure that we express the loyalty to the country in which we live. There's no contradiction between that and maintaining our Jewish identity. It's when we drop our Jewish identity and just decide to merge with the larger identity of a country. That's when we get into trouble. But one thing we've seen is it is possible to, if you have your priorities straight as a Jew, and this is a whole nother class I do a whole presentation. Maybe I'll come back and do it for a different time. It's called Reform Conservative Orthodox, on the history of the movements. We learned some very powerful lessons from that. And the most important lesson, I always say, goes back to the idea of balance. Shimshon Raphael Hirsch, who is really, even though it's one of the few, he's really the father, along with Azriel Hildesheimer, of what we call modern Orthodoxy as a movement. His whole thing, if you read what he says, he's very extreme in what he says. He says it's not a zero-sum game of just being, is the only choice we have is basically to reject everything in modernity, including our being part of a larger culture that's outside of us, and be totally inwardly focused. He says, no, it's not that. But he says if it was a choice between commitment to Torah and engagement with the outer world, forget it. We choose Torah. We choose our Jewish identity. But he said it doesn't have to be that way. And if I'm paraphrasing him now, just like I talked about balance, it's also a question of priorities. This is not a challenge for, I think, the people watching us now, because I think they got their priorities straight. But a lot of the world, one of the failures of what happened with modern Orthodoxy in America is the inability. You have to always make your Jewish identity, your particularist identity, the first priority. Not the only priority, but the first priority, which means all decisions a person makes, regardless where you live, where your kids go to school, that kind of stuff has to be balanced against preserving my Jewish identity. And if that becomes the first priority, then you are then free to engage with the outside world, and you'll be able to do it. By the way, it's much healthier, in my opinion. I'm not a psychologist, but to the extent that a person makes something forbidden, that it's the extent that they have an ability to deal with it, which is why I see this all the time in certain situations with very, very, very religious Jews, their inability to even deal with normal situations that we deal with, like having a conversation with a totally modestly dressed woman. I've seen things that are kind of like blow away. They literally, because they're so cut off from that. So it's something not, the point is not to, in my opinion, to expose yourself to things that could be dangerous on a spiritual level. But if your priorities are straight and you have a solid hashkafic basis and you're confident in who you are, which is what all about being proactive in Judaism and not reactive is all about, then once that is your solid foundation, your ability to deal with the outer world in any situation, be it interacting with people or people who look and dress differently than you, or showing your loyalty to the country in which you live that has given you equal rights, should not be a problem at all, in my opinion. That should not be the issue.
Okay, so I have one more question, then I'm going to open it up. So when you talk about to some degree that what happened, I grew up from, so I saw the change in, I grew up from in Montreal, my grandparents were from, whatever, there was not that broken chain. And I saw growing up from, it was much more of a balanced, normal Yiddishkeit, right? There was no, people met naturally. There was none of this, right? We had Rabbanim in our house. It was. I went to school. I was in school with kids that weren't from, right? And there was no fear. You knew who you were, you knew what you came from, and there was no fear. And you didn't have this crazy amount of people, whoever I grew up with, nobody went off the derech, nobody this, you didn't have all these different things, questions, this, you didn't have any of that. It was just much more of a normal sort of flow with your Yiddishkeit. You knew who you were, and that was it. So my question to you is, we see almost a systemic problem with in all our institutions, right? And it's almost like we have to create institutions to fight the systemic problems that have been created from this institutionalized systemic judgment that is in everything, right? So we have kids off the derech, we have a shidduch crisis, you can go on and on and on and on, like it's non-ending, right? We have to then take the money, build resources to fight all these things. So I don't know if I'm wrong, but it almost seems like this. You said it. You said we almost became it, rather than this balanced Yiddishkeit. We almost became this reactive. Jews, from the midst of ben Adam Lamakom, right, completely obliterating everything else, and created this wall that is created almost like the stones of the base of Mikdash are falling down in in unbelievable numbers. And then we turn around and we hear from a Rabbanim, it's a tikkunim, it's a generation, it's a this. And I don't know, to me, it doesn't look that way. To me, it looks like it's a result of this almost this judgmental, crazy wall we've put up on everything that almost closes everything off and has created this. I don't know. Am I?
Yeah. I mean, in my opinion, Naomi, it's a combination of two things. One is what I talked about, the reactive nature, and really it is. It's a PhD thesis I'm never going to write. You should study epigenetics. Epigenetics is how trauma gets embedded in your DNA. Like a rat that is traumatized, a mother rat, when it gives birth to its babies, the babies who never experienced the trauma exhibit the PTSD that the mother experienced. Ashkenazi Jewish world, much less the Sephardi world, they didn't go through anywhere near that. I'm not just talking about the Holocaust, has gone through that. It's kind of embedded in. So you get that reactive kind of way of looking at the world, but the big change that has taken place, which is people don't appreciate that we tend to retroactively view the frum world of today as the way it was. And like I said before, it is not. The ultra-Orthodox world of today, this massive community of people who are very conformist in their dress and their lifestyle, and everyone is learning in yeshiva, is not the Jewish world throughout history, literally for thousands of years. No such thing existed like that. What you did have when you're talking about, when you're mentioning how you grew up, is a microcosm of what the Jewish world was in Europe. Remember, there was no big frum community in America or Israel. Like really, it's all post-Holocaust. It's the last 80 years. In Europe, and Rev Hillel Cook wrote this in an essay that blew me away when I saw it. It was like an epiphany moment for me. He says, what's happening in the religious world? And he said, Europe, Judaism was always a balance between yeshivas, were these small institutions, not these huge, like the Mir is gigantic, where a teeny percentage of Jews had was not a luxury. To learn in yeshiva in the Mir 80 years ago was Mesiras Nefesh. You're sleeping on the bench and you're eating a piece of bread and onion twice a day and getting schlepped out to a family once a day to get some real food. And you had like one pair of underwear. This was like, but that was a very teeny percentage of the Jews. Everyone else were just, as we call them, Pintele Yidden. They were simple Jews who were religious. They kept kosher. They kept Shabbos. They maybe had a shiur on Shabbos. They did, but they were trying to survive. They were working. He said the Holocaust obliterated that completely. And think about it. The frum world rebuilt itself primarily in two places, in Israel and America, around yeshivas. So first of all, he's given Rosh Yeshivot a status that they have not had since Surah and Pumbedisa, going back 1,000 years ago in Bavel. And it's created a world that is, it used to be this balance. Anyone who was raised, I know this from you see families, the older generations, it was always a balance between the innovations that yeshivas were making, which means any things they came out with in halacha that were chidushim. But the Jewish world, Begadol, as a whole, was a giant super tanker of minhag avosenu b'yadenu. Everyone did what their parents did, and what their parents did, what their great grandparents did. And that was the thing that just chugged along and changed very, very slowly. That was the world that was destroyed. So the even keeled, it's good to use in a ship analogy, of the Jewish people was just that huge mass of simple, not simple, but simple, straightforward, basically from Jews who just did whatever the minhagim were, and they weren't interested in. They liked to learn, but they weren't spending their whole day like delving into the depths of halacha and the Gemara and figuring out and having Rosh Yeshivas. So now we have a Jewish world that has completely rebuilt itself in a totally different way than it ever was, which is now mega conformist, mega innovative. And again, the innovations are not really innovations. They're just layers and layers of, if you take a people who's traumatized post-traumatically, from everything they went through physically and spiritually, and then you have these academic institutions, which what yeshivas ultimately are, that are adding on to that, you're creating sort of, like you said, walls of restrictions, keeping out, and preservation. It's like we're the holy fortress now, which again, I could get in trouble for saying this, but I don't believe it's the healthy way for the Jewish world to be. I think it's reactive, and it's very reactive, and it's very exclusive. It's if you see, by the way, if you look at Chabad, the thing that Chabad really got right, and these are the guys who look really religious, and I deal with a lot of secular Jews who go to Reform synagogues, but they want to go to Chabad because they don't want the lesbian female rabbi playing the cello on Yom Kippur. They want a guy with a beard and a hat who's a Torah observant Jew. But what did they get right that we should all learn from? They welcome everyone. Everyone feels comfortable with them. Mm-hmm. It helps to give out a lot of alcohol because you give like secular Jews a couple of drinks, they chill and they're not so scared anymore. But I'm saying we all need to break out of this mold and stop with it's just too much of the pushing out. And in Israel, it's much, much worse, by the way, in America. You can't behave when you live amongst non-Jews. There's a limit to how badly you can misbehave. The things that go on here that I say, I don't want to go into details and throw out negative energy on a fast day, but I see a lot of very negative things going on here coming from very religious looking people that are not only, who might think they're doing a Kiddush Hashem, but are actually doing massive Chil Hashem and turning off their fellow Jews to Judaism by making them feel like they're looked down on, that you don't really think I'm Jewish. You're yelling at me, you're screaming me, you're calling me a goy. You're doing this, you're doing that. This is I believe a lot of people are just missing the point. And I don't unfortunately hear enough Gedolei Yisrael saying this message. I don't know why I don't hear it, but I don't hear it. And I wish I did hear it more, because I think that would be a titanic shift in the Jewish world, and how the frum world, which are the priests, we are the priests, so to speak, of the Klal Yisrael of today. We are the people supposed to be showing Jews how to be religious in a way that is attractive and open and beautiful. We all know it from the inside. We have to show people on the outside how beautiful it is on the inside.
So before I just to bring out that last point, just one last thing is, so basically if if it's as embedded and as systemic as it's become since the Holocaust. So really, how is it going to change? How are we going to become that nation and those people that you're talking about? It doesn't even seem, it doesn't seem possible. And I have to tell you that when you speak to the young people today, right, to the younger generation, who's looking for authenticity, who feels this sense of what is this that I'm in, or what I've gotten into, right, and I'm part of, they feel a sense of they're demoralized, and they're confused. Either they get on the bandwagon, even in a more extreme way, or they feel really a sense of, I don't know. I speak to families whose entire families' kids have gone off the derech because they can't stand it.
Right. So first of all, I mean, it's a great question you're asking. If we're not going to see it from the top down, because the leadership of the Jewish world, for whatever reason, is not going to be messaging that message, we have to be the change we want to see. So I'm a big believer in bottom-up kind of guy, grassroots. That if the Jewish world always changes very slowly, but if enough people at the bottom decide we want to make a difference, this can start with, again, how we behave, how we look for opportunities to go out of our way. I always tell people when I'm speaking to very religious audiences, I say the first point of the Hippocratic Oath, which doctors take, is first do no harm. Make sure that whatever you're doing, even if I got to preserve my kedusha, but if you embarrass or humiliate another human being because you're trying to stay so holy, then you've accomplished the exact opposite. You've done a chil Hashem. But it has to. We have to, in my opinion, this is not an easy thing to do. We have to start re-messaging what Judaism is about, and getting the big picture in mind, because it's, again, that we have to remove Torah and mitzvahs from being the end game to the means to the end game. And I know that sounds kind of radical, but to me, it's like a no-brainer in Hashkafa. God did not create the world for us just to sit and learn all day long. And learning all day long is fantastic. But he created us to use that body of wisdom as Torat Chaim, the guidebook for living, because you can't represent the Jewish people till you know what the Jewish people represents, but then you got to go out there and do something with it. Now, for some people like myself, okay, I'm a Kiruv guy. I'm out there all the time. But every one of us has the ability, starting now, including everyone watching this call, to make a paradigm shift in their brain, that our job in a world that has lost its direction is to start from the bottom up. Me, like acting in a way that's a positive role model and getting clear in my own brain what we are about as a people. And maybe trying to do like that movie that came out years ago, Pay It Forward. If you get two other people along with you, if every Jew got two more people on the boat with them, we'd have an exponentially huge change in the Jewish world very, very quickly. Now, where, by the way, it goes with, I think, people's kids is because the Jewish world because, by the way, first of all, you cannot keep the best. The Romans said it the best: "Sivi pacem pare bellum." If you want peace, prepare for war. I'm not talking about physical war, but defensive strategies never work in military. I love military history. All the greatest generals and the people who most impacted the world through conquest always did the unexpected and were always on the offensive. That's Alexander the Great. That's Ulysses Grant. That's Ariel Sharon. That's Judah Maccabee. We have to be on the offensive. And on the offensive doesn't mean I'm going to start preaching to you to keep Shabbos. That never works. You push on Jews, they push back. But on the offensive, recognizing first telegraphing to our children that we have a mission in this world, and it's not just to keep Shabbos and learn Torah. We have a mission in this world. Kids are looking for meaning, and we are naturally hotwired, especially young people, to want to make a difference in the world. They're young, they're idealistic, and we've got to show them that is our mission, that we are about making the world a better place. We're not about making the whole world Jewish. We're the people who are going to be the role model, have the wisdom that can bring the ideas out to the world that have transformed the world in the past through offshoot ideas like Christianity and liberal democracy, and will transform the world in the future. And I promise you, if we have a Jewish world that becomes more proactive, our kids will be more into it because they'll see they're on a mission, and mommy and daddy and us as a people are involved in trying to really accomplish something in the world besides just self-preservation or self-ghettoization. And the world will, by the way, non-Jews respect Jews who respect Judaism much more than they respect Jews who run away from it. So if you're a proud Jew, not a judgmental Jew, not an aggressive Jew, but a proud Jew who really exemplifies the midot of Avraham and Sarah, people will respect you and they will follow you, be they Jews or non-Jews. But it's got to start from the bottom up, and it's got to start with us. As Rosh Hashiva used to say, clarity or death. We need to rewire the collective worldview of the Jewish people, to start focusing at this really dangerous time, especially amongst those of us who are responsible because we're the ones who know that Torah and are claiming to represent God in this world. We have to start doing it immediately now. Otherwise, we're going to be in for a very rough ride. And we who are Shomer Mitzvahs and are learning Torah are the one who the creator of the universe, Chalila, is going to hold most responsible. We know that's a fact. That's a fundamental rule in Judaism. So that shouldn't scare us. That should wake us up. And we should thank God. We say every morning, Ashreinu Matov Helkenu. Being Jewish might not be comfortable, but we should thank God we're born into this unique group of people who have this unique connection with the big guy upstairs and the wisdom and the system that can make a true difference in the world. And the world is not going to leave us alone. That is all what the double standard that Israel is about and how the world comes after is Jews. It's all God's way of saying, like Bilam said last week, when we read in the Parsha, Am levadad yishkon. We are a nation that dwells alone, is not reckoned amongst the nations. So if we're going to stand out as Jews, we better the heck stand up as Jews. And that's the real, I think, messaging we have to do now. Like, wake up, because October 7th was a bucket of ice water in the face of Klal Yisrael.
Wow. Wow. It's unbelievable, really unbelievable. But in a way, I always say that, like you said, we almost do it to ourselves, and then we think of ways of how we have to fix it. I don't know. So is anybody have a question? I know we're keeping the rabbi on for a long time because I asked so many things. Does anybody else have a question? Just a question, not anybody else want to ask Rabbi Spiro something? Okay, if not, Rabbi Spiro, I want to just
I do.
Oh,
I have a
go ahead,
question.
Charlene. Go ask the question.
First of all, I love the concept of knowing I'm a Jew because my parents were Jews and so on. I like this aspect. My question, Rabbi, is you talk about universalism and particularism. So my question is the slogan of Ahavta le'arecha kamocha. And I'm having a difficult time because I live among Jews and I live among non-Jews, and I'm supposed to practice that. So is Leracha another Jew or is it the universe? That's my question.
So there's a whole discussion, by the way. It's a great question. I mean, it's the idea in the Shulchan Aruch talks about this because it means Am she'itcha b'Torah v'mitzvahs. That the idea that the people, your first responsibility, Le'arecha, is the people, the other Jews in the world. When that was being said, by the way, almost all Jews were in there with Torah and mitzvahs. So on one hand, and legalistically, there's no statements in the Torah that are not like threshed out to understand what they mean, because there's practical implications for all of these things in terms of how you have to act, what you have to do, when you can violate the Shabbat or not, in what situations. So on a practical level, it's specified by much of Chazal as being specifically focused on the Jewish world that is with us in Torah and mitzvahs. But we know that but you can extrapolate from that out also that we have an obligation to also to lower fellow human beings. We are all, as the prophet Amos says, he says, has not one God made us all? Are we not all his children? So while we have a greater responsibility towards those people who, just in the laws of tzedakah, if you have money to give out, you have to first take care of your immediate family. Then you take care of your community. Then you take care of the Jewish people. And then if you want to give money, you can give money to the greater world at large, but you just have to have your priorities straight. So it's not a simple answer to the question, but I don't think it's a zero-sum game if it's either or. It's either like, okay, it's for the Jews and everyone else can go where, because I'm not interested in it because they're not in my family. No, we understand that we do have a responsibility towards the rest of the world. By the way, you should know that it's fact that our concept of responsibility towards the world has been very much jaded by how the world has so abused us. For instance, the original version of Kol Shematzil Nefesh Echad, anyone who saves one soul, now it says Nefesh Echad B'Yisrael, the famous statement that we use from the Mishnah, anyone who saves one soul of a Jew as if he saved an entire universe. If you look at the Savyad, the original earliest versions of the Mishnah that survive, and the Mishnah goes back 1,800 years, it doesn't say Yisrael, and it just says anyone who saves a life is like they save a universe. So it's almost as if this process of narrowing and self-ghettoizing has actually been whittling it away at us for centuries. And we come by it naturally, given the horrendous historical experience that we've lived through for so many centuries. But it's time that we, put the brakes on and start to stop running away and turn around and start going the other direction.
Right. Right, so true. Okay, Rabbi, thank you so much. This was really unbelievably incredible. I'll send you the recording.
Thank you.
And I'm going to share the recording on the Women's Nishmat Circle and plus on all the different formats that I have on Facebook and on the WhatsApp group. So I want to thank the Rabbi. This was really, really incredible.